These interests merged with organized crime, and then the CIA sort of took on a lot of the rackets that used to be the mob's rackets, where basically they wanted to install a pre-crime system in the United States.
Was the Epstein scandal really a blackmail operation to control the global elite? Were the CIA and organized crime running the drug and human trafficking trade together? How are Democrats and Republicans colluding to mislead the public about Epstein? Has the billionaire class become more powerful than nations, with their own private intelligence agencies? Whitney Webb follows the money and the power to uncover the truth.
What you just brought up earlier, I think, has been really extraordinary, not in the positive sense, but just kind of, I think most people have been kind of taken aback from it, because what does the administration really gain here? After promoting the releases, promoting the perception that they're going to release these files and have this unprecedented era of transparency and things like that. And then instead of doing that, do a very public 180 and just kind of hoped that the trust that some of these figures in government had, like Kash Patel and Don Bongino, having been prominent on the podcast circuit in the past, the trust they built with Trump's base, that being enough for them to kind of swallow this very obvious 180 in rhetoric about these documents. And about a major aspect of the case in general that has been or a theory about, Epstein's death in prison that has been heavily popularized or within Trump's base, which is, Epstein didn't kill himself kind of stuff. And then they, of course, attached themselves to that and walked it back once in government and as, the top two officials in the FBI. So, yeah, what do they stand to gain from it? I don't think anyone really knows at this point, because it's very, we have to be kind of speculative here, because we're not going to get like an admission from the Trump administration about what they're actually thinking. They're obviously worried about PR and optics, and they have continued for months to kick this can down the road and try and make it go away after promising it so extensively. So one can't help but think, but there's things in the files that are inconvenient to either the administration, to Trump himself, or to people very close to Trump and his inner circle. And then that's why the documents are not being released for whatever reason. So, I started a series. Hopefully the next part will be out next week. I have one installment of 3 out, sort of exploring some people in Trump's inner social circle going back a significant amount of time that could stand to lose some things if they, they may be in the documents based on publicly available open source evidence. And allegedly Trump has also been in the documents. But again, the Epstein story is so often they try and sift it into partisan boxes. So, Democrats, because of how badly this has been managed in terms of the PR optics side of it for Trump's base, have seemingly, smelled blood in the water and have tried to pounce on this and pushing to release the files, and are now talking a lot about Epstein. Whereas during, the Biden administration or before that, they didn't really talk about Epstein very much at all, probably because Epstein had a relationship with prominent Democratic politicians, right?
According to Whitney Webb, the Trump administration's handling of the Epstein scandal traps the issue in partisan politics. However, Webb emphasizes that this network involves powerful figures from both parties, notably the Clintons, indicating the issue runs much deeper.
So it's kind of a mess, and it's hard to believe, some of these congressmen, for example, that have come out and said, Trump's name is in the documents and they were going to redact it. That's very well possible, but because of how partisan everything is, until we see that evidence that they were redacted and all of that, it'll be hard to know, So again, I think at the end of the day, as I've said and maintained for years now, the Epstein case and scandal involves figures from both parties, especially in the wake of the Republican Party becoming very Trump-centric ever since 2015, 2016. And Presumably it's problematic for this documentation to come out for some reason. But, again, we have to kind of speculate as to why that is, because this 180 has not really benefited the administration at all, unless there's something, most people aren't seeing. And it's also possible this 180 could have been planned for some purpose we don't know yet, but will reveal itself in time. So either way, it's all a mess. And it's hard to know what's going on, especially because, Trump has now taken the line that it's a Democrat engineered hoax, the whole Epstein scandal. And he didn't say that back in the first administration when Epstein was arrested and then died in prison when he was president the first time. Right. So why did none of that come up then? And why is it now a Democrat hoax? I mean, he was questioned about Epstein plenty when he was, in office the first time. And then, during the 2024 election, he did an interview with Tucker where Tucker asked him about Epstein. He didn't say it's a Democrat hoax. That's obviously a new line. So why is that being made now? And of course, there's a lot of, influencers that are, I guess, closer to Trump world than others that are very willing to, continue and promote this line of thinking. And then, other people in the online sphere have sort of taken it upon themselves to treat Ghislaine Maxwell as you pointed out, a victim, just as the Trump administration is moving to, they move her to a minimum security prison. Allegedly, she's been allowed into some sort of work release program. And it seems increasingly likely she's going to be pardoned in some capacity, which Trump has fielded publicly, both for her and for Diddy before his sentencing. So basically, mainstream media, and I'm sure this will be the same line Congress takes, I'll only really talk about an Epstein-Clinton relationship after Clinton was no longer president. So that would be the well-known trips that Epstein and Clinton, that Clinton took on Epstein's plane, like the trip to Africa, the trip to Asia. These were pretty much entirely associated with Clinton setting up his post-presidential philanthropies, like the Clinton Foundation, the Clinton Health Access Initiative, and the Clinton Global Initiative, which Epstein's defense lawyers later claimed Epstein had a significant role in creating. And of course, the Clinton Foundation later on has ties to the Maxwell family. They inject $1 million plus into Ghislaine Maxwell's Terramar. Her nephew, Alexander Gerassi, works in the State Department under Hillary Clinton, and he had previously been a liaison between Isabel Maxwell's foundation and the Clinton Foundation. And Isabel Maxwell, of course, is Ghislaine's sister. So, who has a lot of ties to what she called her father's Rolodex. So her father being Robert Maxwell, like a pretty well-documented Israeli spy. And some of the figures in those Rolodex are figures like Ehud Barak and Shimon Peres, former prime ministers of Israel. So, there's definitely a lot of interesting overlap there as it relates to, the Epstein-Clinton relationship, but I doubt they'll go down the Israel line.
After exposing the financial and political ties between the Clintons and the Maxwell family, Webb takes the narrative a step further. She argues this network extends to Israeli intelligence through Robert Maxwell, a connection often ignored due to its protected status in U.S. politics.
Because we're talking about, U.S. Congress, and we're talking about the Trump administration, who are very affiliated with the current Israeli government for sure. We may see some stuff about Ehud Barak come out in that. I don't know, because Ehud Barak was one of the people that pressured Clinton to pardon Mark Rich, for example. At the sort of around the as he was leaving the presidency, and then later, not that long after, gets very publicly involved with Epstein, and also gets involved with Ron Burkle, who is probably best known for owning a bunch of supermarkets like Kroger, I believe, and he accompanied Clinton on one of these philanthropic development flights, but also ended up hiring Clinton not that long after that. And Burkle, of course, also has pretty significant ties to Diddy in the same period of time. And I think Michael Jackson as well. So a lot of, I know, you think more people would talk about Ron Burkle, but they don't. It's strange. But anyway, this is all significant, I think, too, because I doubt there is going to be any serious discussion if the Clintons are brought to Congress to ask them about Epstein's 17 visits to the Clinton White House in the 90s. I doubt they will go there. And that's because one of the figures that Clinton was most often, or sorry, that Epstein was most often meeting with was a man named Mark Middleton, who worked in the White House. And Mark Middleton, after it was reported, I think first by the Daily Mail, the full extent of the meetings at the White House, and that Middleton was the main guy he was meeting with, died of a very honestly impossible suicide. And the images and forensic evidence collected at the scene of his death were sealed by a court like right after, so no one can look at it.
Speaking of, oh, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say he was found at this property owned by this NGO called Heifer Ranch, hanging from a tree with a shotgun blast to the chest. Seems pretty improbable. And that was the same year that Jean-Luc Brunel died in prison. So there's like a lot of weird stuff here. And I sort of posit, well, not sort of, I do posit in my book reasons why Epstein would have been meeting with Middleton during this time, because Middleton was basically involved in the scandal that's remembered today as Chinagate, but it was really the second coming of Iran-Contra, I think. And Epstein at the time, through Leslie Wexner, had taken control of Southern Air Transport, it used to be owned by the CIA, and then it was indirectly owned by, CIA people, and was, the main airline of choice for Iran-Contra for smuggling drugs and arms and all sorts of things. And so when Leslie Wexner bought it, and at this point Epstein had power of attorney over all of Wexner's affairs and was basically running his portfolio, it moved from headquarters in Miami, where it was going to Latin America and back into, Mena, Arkansas and all of that. Instead starts going from Columbus, Ohio, where Wexner is based, to Hong Kong. And what were they trafficking? The snake, quote unquote, it's the billionaire class. And so there's a faction of these billionaires in our oligarchy. And of course, the American oligarchy, the American oligarchs don't necessarily, a lot of them don't have an allegiance necessarily to the United States. They have an allegiance to their business interests, which are usually transnational, right? So these guys operate, at a different level than most people of the general public, to say the least, and they engage in a lot of shady activities.
At this point, Webb points to a structure larger than individual scandals. She suggests the real power is an oligarch class serving transnational interests. This class advances its own agenda by creating private intelligence networks and leveraging state intelligence agencies for its own purposes.
Of them, and they can afford to do that. There's actually a long-standing history of this in the United States, beginning with like the Rockefeller family in World War II, of some of these oligarch families basically creating their own private intelligence agencies that work for them. So it's complicated because, anyway, if you think of like U.S. intelligence, who created the CIA? Who was first in the CIA? Well, it was a lot of Wall Street bankers and lawyers. And a lot of, those guys had early ties to British intelligence and things like that. So there's kind of a transnational angle there. But there's a reason why a lot of the early, most well-known coups that the CIA did in other countries and regime change operations were done on behalf of U.S. multinational corporations. They're representing the interests of the oligarch class, and they're basically the secret police of that class and have acted that way for a very long time. And then I argue, of course, in my books that these interests merged with organized crime, and then the CIA sort of took on a lot of the rackets that used to be the mob's rackets, like drugs, prostitution or sex trafficking, arms trafficking, things like that, because once you combine that with, an entity like the CIA, it has state protection. And so you're not being investigated by governments. But you can use governments to go after your competition in the drug trade, in the arms trade, in the human trafficking trade. And you can be on top. And that's what I think ultimately the story is about.
Yeah, it's like, once again, it goes back to the billionaire class. like every time. I always tell people follow the money. So speaking of that, the Diddy situation, I found your article about the Diddy Epstein connection. That was very, very interesting. And I read most of that to my audience. And that, I think, kind of woke me up about the music industry in particular and the ties that they have, like Universal Music Group. We have pointed out that even someone like DJ Khaled, for example, who is Palestinian, had this connections to Universal Music Group, will not say anything about the slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza. And then when you look at the connections, it all makes sense. How long do you think there's been those ties within the music industry where there's Zionist ties there? You mentioned Clive Davis, who has been brought up, I think, numerous times over the years. People have questions about him. And then connecting all that to Diddy, after reading your article, it seems like Diddy was basically like a puppet of sorts when you look at the music industry and the ties that it has to Zionism.
Yeah, so basically the main companies I talk about in the piece are MCA, which later becomes Universal, and then I guess CBS, which, Clive Davis worked for some time before starting his own record label, Arista, which did that, joint venture with Diddy's recording interests. In the 90s. And so basically MCA, Music Corporation of America, has longstanding ties to the Jewish mob in the United States. And so when I talked about the CIA getting in bed with organized crime interests, that organized crime interest in particular is sometimes referred to as the National Crime Syndicate. And this was sort of a meeting of the Jewish mob and Italian mafia through Mayor Lansky and his childhood friend, Charles Luciano, who was later deported to Italy and involved in some sort of a lot of interesting things there, like the nexus between CIA and Mussolini-style fascism and organized crime and all sorts of stuff in Europe. But in terms of, the Lansky sphere, you have connections to people like Lou Wasserman, the longtime head of MCA, and other MCA affiliates. And also MCA was involved in some intelligence-linked operations, specifically the Promise Software scandal of the 1980s, which involved a top MCA executive, along with organized crime linked figures, CIA linked figures, and also involved in the Promise Software scandal was Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's father, and the Israeli intelligence services, in addition to U.S. linked intelligence. So I don't think Israel needs to blackmail Donald Trump.
According to Whitney Webb, there is no need to blackmail Donald Trump. His business career was saved by the Rothschild Bank in the 90s. This, Webb claims, made Trump inherently indebted to these powerful and complex networks of influence from the very beginning.
Why? Because Donald Trump wouldn't exist as a business or political figure if he hadn't. And the Rothschild family has longstanding ties to the Israeli state and also to, the popularization of Zionism in the early 20th century and slightly before then. So, he really owes that bank a lot. And Wilbur Ross, who was the banker working for N.M. Rothschild at the time Trump was bailed out, was rewarded by Trump as being his first Secretary of Commerce, even though Wilbur Ross was at that point, he still is geriatric, but he was geriatric at that point too and was falling asleep in meetings and things like that. And it's not like he was doing a good job, right? So I was widely seen as being a favor for having helped bail Trump out in the early 90s. And it's interesting how Trump sort of got involved in those issues in the first place, because in 1987, I believe, he took a controlling stake in this company called Resorts International that had been linked to organized crime interests, specifically Lansky in the Caribbean. For many, many years, and was allegedly created as some sort of CIA front involving the Dulles brothers, who had organized crime connections also. So he took a controlling stake in that and used it to sort of expand his holdings in Atlantic City, which at the time they were trying to make into the new Vegas, basically. And so, and then that same year, he buys like Adnan Khashoggi's yacht, which Adnan Khashoggi had previously used for sexual blackmail, as I note in my book. And then he starts popping up on or Trump does, on Robert Maxwell's yacht, the Lady Ghislaine, taking pictures with Maxwell, a senator for the late former Senator John Tower, who was Robert Maxwell's main accomplice in his aspect of the Promise software scandal. And then Steve Ross, who I think was CEO of Time Warner at the time. And Ross basically started his company that later took over Warner Brothers, using an organized crime run company. And so there's just a lot of, obviously a cesspool of this world. And it really shouldn't be surprising that Trump would inhabit these kind of social circles, because his mentor was a man named Roy Cohn, and Roy Cohn was involved in, sexual blackmail activities at the Plaza Hotel, which Trump later bought, and then later, had teamed up with elite model management of Casablanca's to host Look of the Year there for a few years. And, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Sorry, a lot of pieces to keep track of here, but basically he's in this, Robert Maxwell world. And sorry, I was talking about Roy Cohn. And Roy Cohn not only was involved in sort of those, sexual blackmail networks, he was also pretty much it's very easy to document, a bridge between organized crime and political power in the U.S. He was involved in the Nixon administration. He was involved in the Reagan administration, while also serving serving as lawyers for top mob bosses, basically.
A lot of it
also being Donald Trump's lawyer and lawyer for like Studio 54 and some of these, shadier nightclubs, which is actually supposedly where Trump met Casablancas of elite models. So
a lot of it just goes back to corruption. A lot of money and corruption, it seems.
Money and power in New York City it obviously involves corruption, I think. If you look at it over the decades, no question there. You have to be part of a club to get in to politics there, for sure. And the upper echelons of power. It's, you have to be part of the modern mob, basically. Peter Thiel.
Webb explains how these corrupt networks evolved with modern technology through Peter Thiel's company, Palantir, as essentially a privatized version of government mass surveillance programs. Palantir has become the most dangerous weapon of these old power structures in the digital age.
Basically, so there was this program after 9/11 called Total Information Awareness, where basically they wanted to install a pre-crime system in the United States, and in order to stop terror attacks before they happen and all of this stuff, right? And it was defunded by Congress because they rightly pointed out that it would erode Americans' constitutional rights and eliminate the right to privacy entirely. And so they defunded it, but they didn't get rid of all of its programs. And then the guy that was running Total Information Awareness was this guy that was the top official in the Reagan administration, arrested for Iran-Contra, and he was pardoned by William Barr when he was Attorney General the first time. Poindexter was his last name. And so Peter Thiel and Alex Karp, when they're making Palantir, go to Poindexter, who they considered basically the godfather of surveillance, and were like, how do we remake this as a private company? And they did that with the help of Richard Pearl, who was in the Bush administration at the time, considered one of the architects of the Iraq War, who's been a longtime agent for Israel embedded in the U.S. government. He wrote a document called, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm blanking on the name right now. That's so embarrassing. But basically, he wrote this policy document for Netanyahu when Netanyahu first came to power in the late 90s, being largely propelled into that role with the help of Ronald Lauder, an American billionaire. And the document basically said, like, we need to overthrow Saddam Hussein, and I also believe the Assad dynasty of Syria for Israel. And so, and then previously Pearl had a lot of other very suspect ties to, the Israeli state that should have gotten him thrown out of government forever, but did not. And so this is basically how Palantir comes to be, in addition to heavy funding from the CIA through In-Q-Tel. And basically, CARP has admitted that Palantir was always intended to have the CIA basically be their main client, and that they, the CIA was their only client for their first several years of existence as a company. And Palantir engineers went to CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, every 2 weeks for several years, having the CIA tweak their product. Intimately involved in this was one of the top chief information guys. I think the top executive, the CIO of the CIA, was a guy named Alan Wade, who, while he was in the CIA, co-founded a company called Gilead with Ghislaine Maxwell's sister, Christine Maxwell. So, this is basically the company that contracts for all 18 intelligence agencies and knows everything about you, according to the New York Times, and probably according to Palantir themselves. And Trump has been openly building databases on people with Palantir. Of course, most people know that they're doing that with ICE, but the administration announced not that long ago that they're doing it for everybody. And Palantir also manages all of your health data because they contract extensively with HHS. So, this is very concerning for a lot of reasons. One point on that I would point to is how Trump in his first term, there was the spate of mass shootings, I believe, in the latter half of 2019. And Trump called on social media companies to stop shooters before they commit a crime, and to basically flag what people were saying on social media and use that to determine if there should be intervention before a crime might be committed, basically.
That's Minority Report.
Actually, William Barr, when he was in office the first time, created this program that legalized pre-crime in the United States. And I think I was like one of two people maybe that reported on that at the time. It was called DEEP. And there's been a few arrests under DEEP for people making Facebook posts and things like that. But not that many. But the legal framework has been there since, Trump round one, basically. But anyway, this pitch that Trump made about having social media spy on its users and use like analytics to, bring about some sort of pre-crime society, he was being pitched at the time and he was interested in it, but it didn't ultimately happen.
Finally, Webb reveals the ultimate goal of these mass data collection and analysis systems. The objective is to create a minority report society that identifies and neutralizes potential threats before any crime is committed, effectively suppressing dissent before it can even emerge.
And creating this agency called HARPA, which was supposed to be like the health version of the Pentagon's DARPA. And the program that they wanted to start with, the acronym was Safe Homes. And it was basically about analyzing American social media posts for early warning signs of neuropsychiatric violence. And then based on that, would either, send people to a court-ordered psychologist or physician, or even, house arrest without them having committed any crime. So now that we have big tech even more intertwined with Trump round two, people should really be paying attention to the stuff, especially now that Palantir, especially through the Doge, formerly led by Elon Musk agency, has sort of embedded Palantir in even more aspects of the government than it was in before, including like the IRS and, mortgage stuff like Fannie Mae and all of that, all have Palantir now. And then basically giving them the keys to the kingdom with a lot of, data that the Department of Treasury has about your finances in the IRS and all of that. All of this is going to go into this master database, and the goal of Palantir, just like it was with total information awareness, is about stopping crime before it happens. It's pre-crime. And Palantir did that, for a few years, several years, in police departments around the country, piloting predictive policing programs, which is pre-crime, in mainly low-income minority neighborhoods, starting off in New Orleans. And now you have other companies besides Palantir that do this. There's one in LA called Predpol, and they have an accuracy of 0.5%. And they haven't gotten rid of the contract. So it's not really about better, more efficient policing, I mean, that's what it's going to be sold as. It's basically the idea that was developed, by the British for prison designs in the 1800s, the panopticon, the idea that if people feel like they're constantly under watch and they could, be well, obviously out of the prison context, you could be put in prison for doing the wrong thing or whatever, then people will police themselves.